Good afternoon, everyone. I am Robinson M. Gasias from BShead Sockstad 3A, one of your discussants for the continuation of the topic Annotations of Antonio Morga's Sucesos de las Islas, Filipinas. So without further ado, let's start. The historian Argensula, in telling of four special galleys for Dasmariñas expedition, says that they were manned by an expedient which was generally considered rather harsh. It was ordered that there be bought enough of the Indians who were slaves of the former Indian chiefs, or principals to form these crews, and the price that which had been customary in pre-Spanish times was to be advanced by the encomenderos who later would be reimbursed from the royal treasury. In spite of this promised compensation, the measure still seems severe since those Filipinos were not correct in calling their dependents slaves. The masters treated these and loved them like sons rather, for they seated them at their own tables and gave them their own daughters in marriage. So ayon kay Rizal, maliraw pala na tinawag itong mga Indians na to na slaves dahil their masters treated them and loved them like sons, rather for they seated them at their own tables and even gave them their own daughters in marriage. So Morga says that 250 Chinese oarsmen who manned Governor Dasmariñas' swift galley were underpaid and had the special favor of not being chained to their benches. According to him, it was covetousness of the wealth aboard that led them to revolt and kill the governor. But the historian Gaspar de San Agustin states that the reason for the revolt was the governor's abusive language and his threatening the rowers. Both these authors' allegations may have contributed, but more important was the fact that there was no law to compel these Chinamen to row in the galleys. They had come to Manila to engage in commerce or to work in trades or to follow profession. Still, the incident contradicts the reputation for enduring everything which they have had. The Filipinos have been much more long-suffering than the Chinese since, in spite of having been obliged to row on more than one occasion, they never mutinied. So itong event na to, kung saan yung 250 Chinese men ay pinatay si Governor Dasmariñas dahil sa iba't ibang dahilan na sinabi rin ni Morga at ni Gaspar de San Agustin. Ito kasing mga Chinese men na to ay pumunta lamang sa Manila para mag-engage sa mga commerce at sa mga pakipagpalitan o kaya ay mag-pursue ng kanilang mga profession. Kaya walang batas o walang karapatan ng mga Espanyol na pagsagwanin sila sa mga ships. Pero sabi ni Rizal, still the incident contradicts the reputation for enduring everything which they have had dahil daw yung mga Pilipinos nga ay mas matagal nang nagsuffer kaysa sa mga Chinese. Pero kahit na ganun, hindi man lang nag-revolt itong mga Filipinos. Hindi katulad ng mga Chinese na pinatay itong Governor Dasmariñas. So it is difficult to excuse the missionaries' disregard of the laws of nations and the usages of honorable politics in their interference in Cambodia on the ground that it was to spread the faith. Religion had a broad field awaiting them in the Philippines, where more than 9/10 of the natives were infidels. Yet even now there are to be found here so many tribes and settlements of non-Christians takes away much of the prestige of the religious zeal which in the easy life in towns of wealth, liberal and fun display grows lethargic. So truth is that the ancient activity was scarcely for the faith alone because the missionaries had to go to islands rich in spices and gold, though there were at hand Mohammedans and Jews in Spain and Africa, Indians by the million in the Americas, and more millions of Protestants, schismatics and heretics people, and still people over 6/7 of Europe. All of these doubtless would have accepted the light and the true religion if the friars under pretext of preaching to them had not abused their hospitality and if behind the name religion had not lurked the unnamed domination. So sabi ni Rizal, ang katotohanan talaga ay itong mga missionaries na to ay hindi lang talaga faith o religion yung kanilang mission, kundi para rin sa domination or colonialism. So, in the attempt made by Rodriguez de Figueroa to conquer Mindanao, according to his contract with the King of Spain, there was fighting along the Rio Grande with the people called the Bohayenes. Their general, according to Argensula, with the celebrated Silonga, later distinguished for many deeds in raids on the Visayas and adjacent islands. Chirino relates an anecdote of his coolness under fire once during a truce for a marriage among Mindanao Principalia. Young Spaniards, out of bravado, fired at his feet, but he passed on as if unconscious of the bullets. Argensola has preserved the name of the Filipino who killed Rodriguez de Figueroa. Excuse me. It was Ubal. 2 days previously, he had given a banquet slaying for it a beef animal of his own, and that made the promise which he kept, to do away with the leader of the Spanish invaders. A Jesuit writer calls him a traitor, though the justification for the term of reproach is not apparent. The Bohayan people were in their country and had neither offended nor declared war upon the Spaniards, because they had to defend their homes against a powerful invader with superior forces, many of whom were by reason of their armor invulnerable so far as rude Indians were concerned. Yet these same Indians were defenseless against the balls from their muskets. By the Jesuits' line of reasoning, the heroic Spanish peasantry, in their war for independence, would have been a people even more treacherous. It was not Ubal's fault that he was not seen, and as it is wartime, it would have been the height of folly. In view of this immense disparity of arms, to have first called out to this preoccupied opponent and then been killed himself. So the muskets used by the Bohayans were probably same that had belonged to Figueroa's soldiers who had died in battle. Though the Philippines had latakas and other artillery, muskets were unknown until the Spaniards came. That the Spaniards used the word discover very carelessly may be seen from an admiral's turning in a report of his discovery of the Solomon Islands, though he noted that the islands had been discovered before. Rizal also annotated that death has always been the first sign of European civilization on its introduction in the Pacific Ocean. God grant that it may not be the last. Though to judge by statistics, the civilized islands are losing their populations at a terrible rate. Magellan himself inaugurated his arrival in the Marianas Islands by burning more than 40 houses, many small crops, and 7 people because one of his ships had been stolen. Yet to the simple savages, the act had nothing wrong in it, but was done with the same naturalness that civilized people hunt, fish, and subjugate people that are weak or ill-armed. So ayon kay Rizal, kamatayan na daw yung palaging senyales na nag-i-introduce na ang European civilizations around the Pacific Oceans. Dahil nga, si Magellan nga mismo, nung kanyang pagdating sa Marianas Islands, ay sinunog niya ang more than 40 houses dahil lang one of his ships had been stolen daw. Pero para daw dito sa mga savages na to or sa mga colonizers na to, wala daw mali doon sa mga ginagawa nila dahil para sa kanila ito daw talaga ang ginagawa ng civilized people. They hunt, fish, and subjugate people that are weak or ill-armed. Subjugate means to gain control over. The Spanish historians of the Philippines never overlook any opportunity, be it suspicion or accident that may be twisted into something unfavorable to the Filipinos. They seem to forget that in almost every case, the reason for the rupture has been some art of those who were pretending to civilize helpless people by force of arms and at the cost of their native land. What would these same writers have said if the crimes committed by the Spaniards the Portuguese and the Dutch in their colonies had been committed by the islanders. So the Japanese were not wrong or were not in error when they suspected the Spanish and Portuguese religious propaganda to have political motives back of the missionary activities. Witness the Moluccas, where Spanish missionaries served as spies, Cambodia, which it was sought to conquer under cloak of converting, and many other nations among them. The Filipinos were the sacrament of baptism, made of the inhabitants not only subjects of the King of Spain, but also slaves of the encomendero and as well slaves of the churches and convents. What would Japan have been now, had not its emperors uprooted Catholicism? A missionary record of 1625 set forth that the King of Spain had arranged with certain members of Philippine religious orders that under guise of preaching the faith and making Christians, they should win over the Japanese and oblige them to make themselves of the Spanish party. And finally, it told of a plan whereby the King of Spain should become also King of Japan. In corroboration of this may be cited the claims that Japan fell within the Pope's demarcation lines for Spanish expansion, so there was complaint of missionaries other than Spanish there. Therefore, it was not for religion that they were converting the infidels. It was colonization. So another annotation of Rizal was about the raid by Dato Sali and Silonga of Mindanao in 1599 with 50 sailing vessels and 3,000 warriors against the capital of Panay. Rizal said that it is the first act of piracy by the inhabitants of the south which is recorded in Philippine history. He said, by the inhabitants of the south, because earlier there had been other acts of piracy, the earliest being that of Magellan's expedition when it seized the shipping of friendly islands, and even of those whom they did not know, extorting for them heavy ransoms. It will be remembered that these Moro piracies continued for more than 2 centuries, during which the indomitable sons of the south made captives and carried fire and sword not only in neighboring islands but into Manila Bay to Malate, to the very gates of the capital, and not once a year merely, but at times repeating their raids 5 and 6 times a single season. Yet the government was unable to repel them or to defend the people whom it had disarmed and left without protection. Estimating that the cost to the island was but 800 victims a year, still the total would be more than 200,000 persons sold into slavery or killed, all sacrificed together with so many other living things to the prestige of the empty title Spanish sovereignty. Still, the Spaniards say that the Filipinos have contributed nothing to Mother Spain and that it is the islands which owe everything. It may be so, but what about the enormous sum of gold which was taken from the islands in the early years of Spanish rule? Of the tributes collected by the encomenderos, of the $9 million yearly collected to pay the military expenses of the employees, diplomatic agents, corporations, and the like, charged to the Philippines with salaries paid out of the Philippine treasury, not only for those who come to the Philippines, but also for those who live, to some who never have been and never will be in the islands, as well as to others who have nothing to do with them. Yet, all of this is as nothing in Filipinos. With so many captives gone, such a great number of soldiers killed in expeditions, islands depopulated, their inhabitants sold as slaves by the Spaniards themselves, the death of industry, the demoralization of the Filipinos, and so forth. Enormous indeed would the benefits which that sacred civilization brought to the archipelago have to be in order to counterbalance so heavy a cost. While Japan was preparing to invade the Philippines, these islands were sending expeditions to Tonkin and Cambodia, leaving the homeland helpless. Even against the undisciplined hordes from the south, so obsessed with the Spaniards with the idea of making conquest. In the alleged victory of Morga over the Dutch ships, the latter found upon the bodies of 5 Spaniards who lost their lives in that combat. Little silver boxes filled with prayers and invocations to the saints. Here would seem to be the origin of the anting-anting of the modern Tulisanes, which are also of a religious character. Thank you.